Okay, get your notes on the spinal cord and spinal nerves, and we'll go over your notes. So first things first, spinal cord delivers impulses to and from the brain and the peripheral nervous system. So remember, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. It's between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. We will see some parts on the next couple of slides when we're looking at this model here. And I've got a better one that shows the cervical enlargement. This is around the shoulder blade area, and it's an enlargement of the spinal cord. When you look at the picture, you can see it better on the one on the right. The spinal cord is relatively small in diameter there, but it gets wider in diameter here. That's in the right around your shoulders area, where your arms come off. That's your cervical enlargement. So it's at the, it's part of your neck, but it's still right about your shoulders. This next slide, you can see on a human here, you can definitely tell that it's swollen there. There's your cervical enlargement due to the large amount of nerves supplying the upper torso, like your arms. And then further down, there's a lumbar enlargement. Further down, the lumbar enlargement due to the large amount of nerves supplying the lower torso, like it's, like going out to your legs even. At the end, the spinal cord forms a blunt tip, a rounded tip called the conus medullaris. So your definition here, below the lumbar enlargement, the end of the spinal cord tapers to form a cone-shaped extremity in the area of the first or second lumbar vertebra. You can see that there it is right about the area of the first, called the conus medullaris. Then you have many nerve fibers coming off. This is called the cauda equina. Cauda is tail, equina is horse. The horse's tail. Spinal segments fan out from the conus medullaris and resemble the hairs of a horse's tail. So there's a whole lot of them there. And then the filum terminale, it means terminal filament, a non-nervous, fibrous connective tissue sheet which anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx. It's a continuation of the innermost protective covering of the brain called the pia mater. That's the innermost meningeal layer. You've heard of cranial meninges and spinal meninges. Well, it's the same covering. It's only when we talk about spinal meninges, it's just those layers are covering the spinal cord. And this is the innermost layer, just attaching the spinal cord to something solid, the coccyx. And again, you can see here's the lumbar enlargement here, and I kind of outlined the conus medullaris, and you see the cauda equina coming off on the one on the left. And look at the one on the right, you see the lumbar enlargement, the conus medullaris, comes to a little cone, a little tip, and then all these strands are the horse's tail, the cauda equina, and the filum terminale right here at the end, they're attaching to the coccyx. So just a couple of pictures there, models and pictures. Now, spinal segment is in your notes, and look at the spinal segment terminology. The spinal cord can be divided into 31 spinal segments. Okay, and these all add up to 31. They're named by a letter designating the area of the vertebral column as well as the chronological order, like C1, C2, C3 for cervical, T1, T2, T3 for thoracic, L is for lumbar, and S for sacral. There are spinal nerves. There are 31 spinal nerves. So where the segments are, the spinal nerves will exit between the vertebrae through those intervertebral foramen, those little holes that are formed when the vertebrae are stacked. So there are 31 pairs of nerves that originate or begin at each of the 31 segments of the spinal cord. The spinal nerves are formed as a result of the union of the dorsal and ventral roots, which we'll look at in just a minute. Because they carry both sensory and motor fibers, they're called mixed nerves. They have both sensory and motor. Now I put it up over here in a little box, and you can fill in your blanks there. There are 8 pairs of cervical nerves. So 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Okay, 1 coccygeal, and there it is right there. So you have 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. So those are going to be your nerves that come out and service your body. Now looking at a cross section of a spinal cord. Here's a spinal cord here. And these pieces right here that are joined together are called your spinal nerves. So the segments, or there's this area here that has these 2 branches that join together to form the nerves. There's 31 of these segments, and there's 31 of these nerves. So let's look at parts of this cross section of the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord. All this other stuff is outside the spinal cord. There's your spinal cord. The posterior is on the back. So this little invagination here, this little valley here, is called the posterior median sulcus, a shallow, long groove on the posterior surface of the spinal cord. Well, there's one on the anterior also, called the anterior median sulcus. Now, some books use fissure, some use sulcus, and some use one as a sulcus and one as a fissure, so they're both the same thing. The anterior is a deeper groove on the anterior surface of the spinal cord on the front. So this is the back side, this is the front side. Dorsal, ventral, posterior, anterior. Looking at some more stuff. Sensory or afferent neurons. Well, here's a receptor, and here is a sensory neuron. This is the dendrite of the sensory neuron because it's going toward the cell body. And there's your sensory neuron with this. It's a unipolar cell, and it's located in this swollen structure here. And here comes the axon of that sensory neuron right there. So sensory or afferent neurons carry information to the spinal cord by way of the dorsal root. Okay, this is the dorsal root here. Dorsal root. It's on the back side, and they call it a root. It has the nerves in it. The cell bodies of the sensory neurons are located in a swollen structure. There's the cell bodies in this swollen structure, and I labeled it over here, the dorsal root ganglion, a collection of cell bodies of neurons outside the central nervous system is called a ganglion. This is on the dorsal root, and it's a swollen spot that holds cell bodies of the sensory neurons. So it's called the dorsal root ganglion. And you can see there's the cell body of the sensory neuron. And that's where they're found. Axons of the motor neurons exit the ventral root. So here's the cell body, and here's the axon, the blue fiber, going out this lower root, which is called the ventral root. The dorsal and ventral roots join to form the spinal nerve. Where they leave together, that's the spinal nerve, and I have it labeled on the other side, spinal nerve. Carrying both sensory and motor fibers. Yep, both of them are in there. These spinal nerves exit through the intervertebral foramen. You remember when the vertebrae are stacked on the side, there's a little hole there on each side for the spinal nerves to exit, and those are called the intervertebral foramen. The holes between the vertebrae, which are formed by the stacking of the vertebrae. You see this motor neurons going out to an effector out here. And we will talk about this interneuron in just a minute. It's between the sensory and the motor. It transfers the impulse from the sensory to the motor, as well as possibly up to the brain and up and down the spinal cord to other motor cells. Motor neurons that go out to the effectors. White columns and gray horns. So we have white matter on your notes. Myelinated axons of neurons. Remember, the white is because of the myelin sheath. The extra phospholipid bilayer wrapped around and around and around those fibers gives it a little bit different color. And so it's called white matter. So we're going to talk about those. A tract is a bundle of fibers within the central nervous system. Ascending tracts are going up the spinal cord to the brain to be interpreted. Those are sensory. And descending tracts coming down from the brain to an effector like a muscle or a gland, those are going to be motor. Now when you look at on here we have white matter. We have columns, the posterior white column here, the lateral white columns on the side, and the anterior white column is in the front. Okay. So we have gray matter, the nerve cell bodies and dendrites, or unmyelinated axons and neuroglia. So these are not myelinated, and this is the gray matter here. Okay. Unmyelinated cell bodies and fibers. That's the gray matter. Well, in the spinal cord, it looks like a little butterfly, and these little tips of the wings are called horns. So it has horns, gray matter in the spinal cord, and there are several. The posterior gray horn, so this projection here is the posterior gray horn. The one out to the side is the lateral gray horn, and the one in the front is called the anterior gray horn. Now we have ascending tracts and descending tracts as in your notes. Okay. Ascending tracts, sensory axons, which conduct sensory impulses toward the brain. Okay, it's going to go up. So that would be some fibers that are in this gray matter are going to go up. Descending tracts, motor tracts, which conduct impulses from the brain to the effectors. So down and out by way of a motor neuron going out to an effector. Examples, I just made some up, so these are probably not going to ever be found. I made them up as far as I know. Anterior, I told you which side, the front side. Spinothalamic tract, from the spine to the thalamus. So it's going up, the spine to the thalamus, which is in the brain. Lateral, on the side. Corticospinal, cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. So it's going to be a descending tract. So I just gave you some names of some tracts. The names are extremely elaborate, and unless you go to medical school, you're really not going to need to know those, okay? Just know what an ascending and a descending tract happens to be. And you'll see that they're connected in the middle. The two sides are connected in the middle. That's our next slide. That's called the gray commissure, a bridge of axons crossing from one side of the spinal cord to the other. It's called the gray commissure. It's that little bridge across. And in the center, there is a little hole that goes the entire length of your spinal cord called the central canal, a narrow canal which runs the length of the spinal cord. It's located in the center of the gray commissure. There it is right there. And contains cerebral spinal fluid from the ventricles of the brain. Now, the ventricles are going to be spaces or cavities in the brain that produce cerebrospinal fluid, which is a nutritive fluid for the central nervous system. Now we have a nerve as a bundle of fibers, axons and dendrites. You have somatic afferent dendrites, somatic body afferent going toward, and somatic efferent that's going toward the nervous system, and somatic efferent axons which are going out. Those are myelinated. Now, ganglion, that's why I put this one on, it's in your notes, a collection of cell bodies of neurons located outside the central nervous system and even outside the peripheral nervous system. They're also called ganglia. It's a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Remember what the central nervous system is? The brain and spinal cord. So it's outside the spinal cord, a collection of cell bodies, and it's called a ganglion. A nucleus is a neurons where the neuron cell bodies and dendrites are inside the central nervous system. That's what we call gray matter. I just circled several. The thalamus is a collection of gray matter. The putamen, another nucleus. They all different things. A caudate nucleus, they got that one right there. A ventricular nucleus, oh yeah, right there. Globus pallidus, tail of the caudate nucleus, which we're not going to get into all those nuclei in general. You can get as specific as you want on the nervous system. The more you put in there, the more there is to remember, and it gets very, very sticky because it is so complex. So I just want you to know that all these collections of gray matter, those are all different nucleuses, and they usually have an interpretive job controlling something, or monitoring something, controlling something, emotions, mannerisms, movements, this type of stuff. all your sensory information except smell come up through the thalamus, and it's filtered out to the surface of your brain to see if you've ever experienced something. And then it comes back down and is sent out by way of motor neurons out to some effectors. Covering the brain and the spinal cord. This is cranial meninges because it's covering. If it was covering the spinal cord, it'd be called the spinal meninges. So it's just the location. It's the same layers. It's just where they're found. So the meninges, protective membranous coverings of the brain and spinal cord. So let's look at the first one I have boxed over here on the right, the dura mater. Dura means durable or tough, and so that means tough, and mater is Latin for mother, and it's just the way they named it, the tough mother. It's a tough layer, and I can guarantee you that that is kind of like a piece of vinyl. It is very hard to tear. You have to cut to get through it. Composed of dense connective tissue. So that's going to form a protective outer layer around your brain and spinal cord. And we're going to see in a minute that you see that it has two layers, one up against the bone, the periosteal, and one that's down below, the meningeal. And the periosteal stays up on top, and the meningeal forms a layer between the hemispheres. And when it does that, it forms a vein also right here. And we're going to talk about the falx cerebri in just a little bit, but it's going to be between the left and right hemispheres of your brain. The second layer is the arachnoid mater. Arachnoids are spiders. So this is a spider mother named after these elastic and reticular fibers that hang down into a space. So this little pink layer is the arachnoid mater, and it has, like it says here, it means spider mother. The upper portion is composed of simple squamous epithelial cells, that pink, and the lower portion contains delicate network of collagen and elastic. It is collagen and elastic. Collagen and elastic fibers are hanging down. So in real life, it looks like spider web, so they call it the spider mother. And that space there is called the subarachnoid space, and that's where cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow. It's right in that space where all those little fibers hang down, collagen and elastic. The innermost one is called the pia mater, and pia means delicate, so it's the delicate mother. It's the innermost layer, a thin mesh of elastic and collagen fibers that's in close association with the surface of the brain and spinal cord. They're right on the surface of the brain and spinal cord. If we had one in lab, you would have to get like a needle or a pen, and you could raise up that pia mater off the surface. It makes it look real shiny, but it's right on the surface, very close to the surface. Yeah, very clear, very close. Now that pia mater also, like it says here, denticulate ligaments. So let's look at this next slide. Pia mater denticulate ligaments. It goes out and it can form little supportive structures on the outside of the spinal cord, extend from the pia mater through the arachnoid to the dura mater. These structures prevent lateral movement of the spinal cord, so they're going to help to support the spinal cord and help keep it anchored in the middle of your vertebral foramen. Now we're going to look at something to have a blank here in your notes, and it's going to be cerebral spinal fluid. But let's look at something before we do that. Here's what I promised you. The dura forms some sheets, and we'll probably talk about these again in just a minute, maybe. I'll have to see. But the one that goes down between the hemispheres, this dura, is called the falx cerebri, and it helps to stabilize the brain and your cranial cavity from going left and right. There's also, it continues down, and there's one between the lower portion of your brain, which is called the cerebellum down here. We'll see that on another lecture, maybe on this one. It's in between the hemispheres of the cerebellar hemispheres, and it's called the falx cerebelli. Helps to, again, stabilize the brain from going lateral. It also goes between the cerebrum and cerebellum, between the cerebellum down here and the cerebral hemispheres up here. It goes in between them, called the tentorium cerebelli. So that dura is going to help to secure the brain and your cranial cavity and prevent it from being able to move around very easily. Concussion is where something really hits hard and your brain hits the side of your skull on the inside. And the dura is there to help prevent that from happening. Now let's talk about something. Your notes kind of diverge now. There's a blank spot there, so this is something you'll have to write down or look at on your lab handout. I've got this on your lab handout also. There are four ventricles of the brain. Ventricles are spaces in the brain, and they are the spaces into which cerebrospinal fluid is secreted by some capillary beds called choroid plexes. So let's look at these spaces. There are four ventricles. You have two that are called lateral ventricles because they're in each hemisphere. You have one right in the middle called the third ventricle, and then one at the base, down at the base of the cerebellum, kind of swells out a little bit, called the fourth ventricle. Now this is looking at someone head on, the face. You can see it like this. If you look at it from the side, you can see the two lateral ventricles. You see that they actually are coiled around like that. There is a connector between the laterals and the third. You can see it's labeled right here, interventricular foramen. It's a hole or a little tube between the laterals and the third, and you can see it's connecting here. Here's your third ventricle. There's also a tubular structure called the cerebral aqueduct, which lets that cerebrospinal fluid go down to the ventricle down here. So there are four ventricles, and that's how they're connected together. The two laterals connect to the third by these interventricular foramen, and the third connects to the fourth by the cerebral aqueduct. And then we're going to see that there are four exits from this fourth ventricle. We'll look at that in just a minute. Now here's the cerebral spinal fluid secretion and flow. I don't know what happened to my heading here, but let's just look at what's going on here. Cerebral spinal fluid, that's what CSF stands for, is secreted by the choroid plexus in each lateral ventricle. Well, there are four ventricles, so there are four choroid plexes. The choroid plexes are very specialized capillary beds, and they form the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is very selective as to what can cross, what can leave your blood and make up what we call cerebrospinal fluid. I told you before that there are a lot of medications that cannot go across the blood-brain barrier, and so they cannot affect your central nervous system. And so that's what it's there for, to protect what is given access to your central nervous system. But those capillary beds, what they do secrete, that cerebrospinal fluid, contains nutrients like glucose and other electrolytes, water, oxygen, and it picks up carbon dioxide and all the waste materials and takes them away from your central nervous system. So let's start over again. Cerebrospinal fluid is secreted by the choroid plexes of each of the lateral ventricles. Well, you can't see the lateral ventricles because they're on the sides, right? They're inside the two hemispheres, so they're going to be hidden. You can't see them. Cerebrospinal fluid flows through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle. With interventricular foramen, it's going to be right, oh, there it is, pointed out too. So those two laterals are going to drain their fluid into this one right here, into the third ventricle, which is number 3. Now, they do show a choroid plexus here. There's the choroid plexus. This one, I think they're showing probably that's going to be in the lateral ventricle, but they can't show you the whole lateral ventricle, but they show a choroid plexus. This one's in the third ventricle, which is all this space around in here, and it's labeled 3. Choroid plexus in the third ventricle adds more cerebrospinal fluid. So it's going to also produce cerebrospinal fluid. So the fluid levels are building up. They got to be pushed somewhere. Number 4, cerebrospinal fluid flows down the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. So here's from the third down the cerebral aqueduct. There it is, right? It's labeled to the fourth ventricle, which is at the base of this tree here called the arbor vitae. Arbor is a tree, and vita is life. Looks like a tree. So here's the fourth ventricle down here. And there's a choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle. There it is, number 5, choroid plexus in the fourth. Now 6, cerebrospinal fluid flows out of 2 lateral apertures. Now they show one right here, but there's one on the left and one on the right. So that's how it's going to leave the fourth ventricle. There's one median aperture. It's at the back, and you can see the arrows coming out there. And the central canal, right down the center of the spinal cord. So there are 4 exits from the 4th ventricle that cerebral spinal fluid will leave from. Look at number 7. Cerebral spinal fluid fills the subarachnoid space. Remember I told you the subarachnoid space is where cerebral spinal fluid circulates. And it's the space that has the collagen and elastic fibers hanging down from the subarachnoid layer there of epithelial cells. So cerebral spinal fluid fills the subarachnoid space and bathes the external surfaces of the brain and spinal cord. Well, the external surface of the brain is called the cerebral cortex, and it's about 6-7 layers of cell bodies of neurons. And the spinal cord in the middle, if you remember the gray horns and the gray commissure had the central canal in the middle. Well, that fluid going down the central canal supplies nutrients for that gray matter in the center of your spinal cord. Number 8, at the arachnoid villi, cerebral spinal fluid is reabsorbed into the venous blood of the dural venous sinuses. Okay, so it's going to, when it leaves these exits out of the 4th ventricle, the 2 laterals, the 1 median, and the central canal, it's in the subarachnoid space when it exits. That's this space, this blue here, that's the subarachnoid space. And it's going to circulate around the, down the spinal cord, around the cerebellum, around the cerebrum. It's coming up here. And look at number 8. At arachnoid villi, these little extensions that go from the arachnoid mater into a vein that's formed by the dura mater. It's called the superior sagittal sinus. And the fluid is going to leave and go into this superior sagittal sinus, which is dark purple here. And then that's where it ended there. It's going to go superior sagittal sinus. It comes down here to the back. There's one that goes left and right, the transverse sinuses. And then it does a little jig-jag as it goes down through the jugular foramen, called the sigmoid sinus. And then the jugular vein is what they dump into. So the jugular vein is what's formed as this is completed. Let's go on down to this one. Here it's showing the same structures here, everything. Here's your, I guess that's going to be the lateral ventricle, letting you see inside the lateral ventricle. Here's your interventricular foramen to your 3rd ventricle, which has the cord plexus, cerebral aqueduct to the 4th ventricle, which has 4 exits, 2 lateral, 1 median, and the central canal. It circulates around the spinal cord and around the brain. And it goes to the top here, number 4 there. Cerebral spinal fluid is absorbed into the dural venous sinus by way of the arachnoid villi, these little projections that go up into this superior sagittal sinus here. And that's a vein which will eventually become the jugular vein. So I'll go over that a couple of times. You have some pictures here. It's pretty explanatory on that one. If you have any questions, though, remember the Q&A session, and you can always email me. Spinal nerve coverings. Okay, these are coverings of the spinal nerve, and they're going to be very similarly named to the ones that cover muscle. A series of connective tissues surrounding the nerve and its components. This covering is very similar to that of skeletal muscle. All right, so number 1 is the epineurium. Upon the nerve, it covers the whole outside of the nerve. Just like the epimysium covered the entire muscle, the epineurium covers the entire nerve. Now, the epineurium is going to go in and cover bundles of bundles of fibers, axons, and dendrites. Remember that bundle is called a fascicle, and there it is labeled there too, fascicle, a bundle of fibers. And because it does that, it's called the perineurium. Just like in the muscle, it was perimysium, it's perineurium, covering a bundle of fibers, covering a fascicle. And that goes in and covers each individual fiber as the endoneurium. So endoneurium, fibers of the perineurium, which invaginate to cover each of the fibers, axons and dendrites of the fascicle. And you can see it right there. It's on the outside of the myelin sheath. So the coverings are named very similar. Whole nerve, fascicles of fibers, individual fibers. Now when this these nerves come out. There's your spinal nerve there. They branch. And remember, the word for branch is ramus. So they form a dorsal and a ventral ramus, a branch off of a spinal nerve. The dorsal ramus goes to the skin and deep muscles of the back. It's on the back. The ventral ramus goes to the body wall, limbs, and ventrolateral body surfaces. So it goes to the front and sides and the front of the body. Now a dermatome, this shows where these nerves go to when they go out to the front and the back and how they go straight out. If this guy put his arms out to the side, you would see that blue would go straight out, and so would the green. Put his legs out straight out to the side, the red would go out with each leg, as well as the purple would follow. So they go straight out to those areas. So a dermatome, the area of the body surface which is monitored by the ventral rami and the dorsal roots. Okay, the branches, basically, dorsal rami. By knowing the areas the nerves go to, most lesions can be located by testing the areas with a hair or a pin. And that's when people have damage to their spine, their vertebrae by a wreck or something, and they can't feel. That's when they'll go and start testing with the little feather or the little wire to try to find out where the damage or swelling could occur along the vertebrae where the nerves come out. So they're testing to see possibly where the damage occurred. A plexus, there are several plexes. Plexus means braid, a network of interwoven nerves of adjacent ventral rami, the ones that are next to each other. We have a cervical plexus here. Cervical means the neck. So I have all this stuff written here. The cervical plexus is a group of nerves located in the neck. It is one of the most complex structures in the body, providing sensory and motor nerve supply to parts of the neck, upper back, and arms. Branches from the cervical plexus also supply nerve impulses to the diaphragm and a large muscle that empowers breathing. Yeah, your diaphragm's a major one there. You have the brachial plexus, number 2, goes to your neck and shoulders. There it is right there. The brachial plexus is a group of nerves that comes from the spinal cord in the neck and travels down the arm. These nerves control the muscles of the shoulder, elbow, wrist, and hand, as well as provide feeling in the arm. When I had my elbow surgery, when I broke my elbow, they gave me a shot in this plexus, and I didn't even know I had an arm. I had nothing out there, no feeling, no nothing. A little further down is the lumbar plexus. Nerves that arise directly from the lumbar plexus are responsible for innervation to the psoas muscles. Remember where those are? Up around your pelvis. Quadratus lumborum, lumbar transverse muscle. So basically the lumbar area. And the sacral plexus provides motor and sensory nerves for the pelvis, buttocks, genitals, thighs, calves, and feet. So that sacral plexus goes down your legs. And if you've had anybody that had sacroiliac pain, that was why. The nerves that go down there, sciatica, that type of stuff. A reflex arc. So in your notes, the second function of the spinal cord is to serve as a reflex center. Reflexes are rapid, automatic responses to stimuli. Reflexes, there it is. There is no thought involved in a reflex. Reflex responses are possible due to the components of the reflex arc, which consist of a receptor. These are going to be free nerve endings that I pointed out here of the sensory neuron. A sensory neuron, there's the dendrite, the cell body, and the axon of the sensory neuron. Center in the central nervous system, there's the interneuron, which is in the central nervous system. It's in the center of the spinal cord. There's your interneuron between the sensory and motor. A motor neuron, there's a cell body, and here comes the axon out to the effector, a muscle or a gland. So reflexes have no thought. Responses do have a thought. You think about it for a second or two, and then you respond. A reflex does not. So when you touch something hot and it burns, you've already started to pull away from that before you consciously pull your hand away. You get stuck by a pin, you've already started the process of pulling back before you consciously do it. The interneuron there is also called an association neuron. It can not only transfer an impulse from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, but it can also relay impulses up and down the spinal cord, up and down to other muscles, other motor neurons, and up to the brain for interpretation of something's happening down here. Now, reflex center, let's then stretch reflex. Let's just read a little bit of this. Another type of reflex is the stretch reflex. All right, that's right here, because you have these little receptors in here called stretch receptors. This type of reflex involves receptors in the muscles, which are called muscle spindles or spindle fibers. You could call them that too, muscle spindles. They're a type of stretch receptor. When stimulated, a sensory neuron sends an impulse to the dorsal root. So, when the doctor hits your patellar tendon here, well, that's actually a patellar ligament there, it causes a real slight pull of your quads. Well, those receptors are going to pick it up. The stretch receptors will pick that up. And here goes your impulse. Stimulated neuron sends an impulse to the dorsal root. Here it comes. Comes into the dorsal root. The impulse synapses with the motor neuron and the gray matter of the spinal cord. Well, it's got the interneuron, and it's going to synapse with the motor neuron. The axon of the motor neuron exits the ventral root and goes to the effector muscles, and it causes a knee jerk. So it says a simple reflex, example is a knee jerk. So when the doctor hits your patellar ligament here, it stretches that muscle and it sets off a reflex. And that's why that muscle partially contracts and your leg goes forward. You didn't do that. It was a reflex. There's another one, I don't have a picture of it in here, but it's called the flexor reflex. Involves more than 2 neurons. And this would involve a stimulus like a pinprick. A pinprick is picked up by the receptor, and the sensory neuron sends the impulse to the spinal cord, just like this one does. By way of the dorsal root, the synapse occurs with an interneuron, just like this. The interneuron synapses with the motor neuron, impulse is sent out to the ventral root to the effector. They're just caused by 2 different things. Stretch receptors are caused by a stretch in the muscle, and this other one, the flexor reflex, is the result of something stimulating you that's adverse. A pain, a cut, a burn, a prick, a pinprick, something like that. Well, there's another one that this is not learned. This is wired into your body. It's called the crossed extensor reflex. Now, we're not going to get too much into following all the lines, but let's just get the concept. Occurs when a stimulus causes flexion of the muscles of one limb and extension of the muscles in the opposite limb. Now, this has to do with walking. You step on a rock, you're going to lift that foot up, but you also notice that the opposite leg extends to keep your balance. So this is called a crossed extensor reflex. You do not learn this. This is wired into your nervous system as you're being formed. This is a pretty cool one, crossed extensor reflex. And that's the end of this lecture.